You know, that moment when you're alone at night and suddenly a memory hits you, not just any memory, but that one wound that never quite healed, that conversation you wish you could take back, that goodbye you never got to say, or that moment when life changed forever. We all carry these invisible scars, don't we? Think about that wound you're carrying right now. The one that still makes your heart skip a beat when you remember it. The one you've tried so hard to forget, yet it stays with you like a shadow that refuses to fade. Some of you might be thinking about a childhood moment when you felt completely alone. Others might be remembering words that cut deeper than any knife could. And some of you are thinking about that person who's no longer here and how that empty chair at your dinner table still feels impossible to look at. These wounds, they're not just memories. They're not just past events that we can file away in some mental cabinet. They become part of our story, woven into the very fabric of who we are. And today, we're going to talk about why some of these wounds stay forever. And more importantly, why that might not be the curse we think it is. I want to share something profound with you. For years, I struggled with understanding why certain pains wouldn't fade. Why, despite all the self-help books, despite all the therapy, despite all the well-meaning advice to just let it go, some hurts remained as fresh as the day they were inflicted. And then one day, while watching a craftsman repair a broken pottery piece, using the Japanese art of kintsugi, mending broken pottery with gold, everything changed. You see, in Japanese culture, they don't try to hide the cracks. They don't pretend the breaking never happened. Instead, they fill those broken places with gold, creating something even more beautiful than the original. Our wounds, our scars, our broken places, they're meant to be filled with gold too. But here's what nobody tells you about permanent wounds. They're not just scars. They're portals to profound wisdom. Think about it. The person you are today, the depth of your empathy, the strength of your resilience, the breadth of your understanding, how much of that came from your moments of deepest pain? Remember that child who was told they weren't good enough? That wound created an adult who fights for others' worth. Remember that devastating loss that brought you to your knees? That wound taught you the true value of love and presence. Remember that betrayal that shattered your trust? That wound gave you the wisdom to understand human nature and all its complexity. Our permanent wounds become our permanent teachers. They're not just injuries to recover from. They're initiations into deeper understanding. Every time that old pain surfaces, it's not just reopening a wound, it's reopening a doorway to wisdom. But let's be honest. This isn't about putting on a brave face and pretending everything happens for a reason. This isn't about toxic positivity or denying the reality of pain. Some wounds stay forever because they're supposed to. They're meant to keep us humble, keep us human, keep us connected to our own humanity and the humanity of others. Think about the great change makers throughout history. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't speak about justice despite his wounds. He spoke about it because of them. Mother Teresa didn't serve the poor despite her struggles with faith. She served them while embracing her doubts. Their wounds became their purpose. You might be sitting there thinking, but I don't want this pain. I don't want this reminder. I want to be whole again. Here's the truth that took me years to understand. You are whole. Your wounds are not subtractors from your wholeness. They're additions to your wisdom. They're not holes in your story. They're chapters that make it rich and meaningful. Imagine for a moment that you could erase all your permanent wounds, every heartbreak, every loss, every disappointment, gone. Would you really be more whole? Or would you be less? Would you be stronger? Or would you have lost the very experiences that forged your strength? The most powerful thing about permanent wounds is that they connect us. In a world where we're increasingly isolated, where we're taught to present perfect, filtered versions of ourselves, our wounds are what make us real. They're what make us human. They're what allow us to look into another person's eyes and say, I understand. I've been there too. You see, when we stop trying to heal what's meant to stay with us, when we stop fighting against the permanence of certain wounds, something miraculous happens. We find freedom. Not the freedom from pain, but the freedom to carry our pain with grace, to let it teach us, to let it guide us toward greater understanding and deeper connections. Think about the ocean for a moment. The deepest parts of the ocean are dark, cold, and under immense pressure. Yet it's in these depths that some of the most remarkable life forms exist. Our permanent wounds are like those ocean depths. They might be dark, they might be heavy, but they're also where our most remarkable growth happens. What if, just what if, these permanent wounds aren't punishment, but preparation? What if they're not obstacles to overcome, but instruments to use? What if every time that old pain surfaces, it's not a reminder of what you lost, but a reminder of what you've gained: wisdom, depth, understanding? I want you to try something with me. The next time you feel that familiar ache of an old wound, instead of trying to push it away, welcome it. Say to it, "What are you here to teach me today?" Because here's the truth. The wound that stays forever isn't your enemy. It's your guide. It's not your weakness, it's your wisdom. And this brings us to something even deeper: the way these permanent wounds shape our relationships with others. Have you ever noticed how the people who've been through the deepest pain often have the greatest capacity for love? It's as if their wounds created more space within them, more room for understanding, more capacity for genuine. Let's talk about what happens in those quiet moments when we're alone with our permanent wounds. You know those moments when the world goes quiet and all we can hear is the echo of past pain. Most people will tell you to distract yourself, to stay busy, to focus on something else. But I'm going to tell you something different. Those moments are sacred. In my years of exploring human consciousness and potential, I've discovered something remarkable. Our permanent wounds often carry messages we're not ready to hear until years, sometimes decades, after they're inflicted. It's like receiving a letter that can only be read when you've developed the wisdom to understand its content. Think about relationships for a moment. How many times have you heard someone say, "I'll never let anyone get that close again"? It's a natural response to pain. But here's the paradox. It's often our permanent wounds that enable us to form the deepest connections with others, because when you've been broken open, you can see the broken places in others. When you felt deep pain, you can recognize it in someone else's eyes. But let me be clear about something. This isn't about wearing your wounds like badges of honor. It's not about defining yourself by your pain. It's about understanding that these permanent marks on your soul have a purpose beyond the hurt they caused. They're like spiritual calluses. They might mark where you've been hurt, but they also mark where you've grown stronger. Consider this: every major transformation in human history has come from people who carried the greatest art, the most profound literature, the most impactful movements for social change. They all came from people who didn't just survive their wounds, but learned to use them as instruments of transformation. You might be thinking, but how? How do I transform this pain that won't go away into something meaningful? The answer lies in a simple but profound shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" start asking, "What does this enable me to understand that I couldn't have understood any other way?" Let me share a profound truth that changed everything for me. Our permanent wounds often become our greatest gifts to the world, not despite the pain they cause, but because of it. The person who lost everything and rebuilt their life becomes a beacon of hope for others facing similar challenges. The one who experienced betrayal and learned to trust again becomes a guide for those still stuck in the darkness of distrust. But here's where many people get stuck. They keep waiting for the wound to heal completely before they try to help others. They think they need to have everything figured out first. But that's not how it works. Your wound doesn't need to be healed to help heal others. Sometimes it's in the process of helping others that we find our own healing. Think about the times when you felt truly understood by someone. Chances are, it wasn't because they had perfect advice or all the answers. It was because they could sit with you in your pain because they understood it from the inside out. That understanding didn't come from books or theories. It came from their own permanent wounds. Now, I want to address something that might be coming up for some of you. You might be thinking, "But I'm tired of carrying this pain. I'm exhausted by it." I hear you. And yes, carrying permanent wounds is exhausting. But here's what I've learned. It's not the wound that exhausts us, it's our resistance to it. It's the energy we spend trying to pretend it's not there, trying to fight against its permanence. What if you could learn to carry your wound with grace? What if, instead of seeing it as a burden, you could recognize it as a source of wisdom. This isn't about minimizing your pain or pretending it doesn't hurt. It's about understanding that your permanent wounds have shaped you in ways that make you uniquely qualified to understand and help others. Every time you touch your own wound with compassion, you become better equipped to touch others' wounds with healing. Every time you find meaning in your pain, you become better able to help others find meaning in theirs. Your permanent wounds aren't just about your personal story anymore. They're about your contribution to the larger human story. You see, we're all connected by our wounds. In a world that often feels disconnected and divided, our shared experience of pain and resilience is one of the strongest bonds we have. When you learn to speak from your wounds with wisdom rather than bitterness, you create spaces where others can begin to heal too. And here's something even more profound. Your permanent wounds often become the very places where your purpose finds you. Think about it. How many therapists were once patients? How many addiction counselors were once addicts? How many peace activists were once victims of violence? Our deepest wounds often point us toward our highest calling. Now let's dive into something that might challenge everything you believed about healing. Society often tells us that healing means returning to who we were before the wound. But what if that's not what healing really is? What if true healing isn't about going back, but about going forward as someone new, someone deeper, someone who carries their wounds with profound purpose? I remember sitting with a group of people who had all experienced profound loss. What struck me wasn't their pain, it was their depth. These weren't broken people. These were people who had been broken open, and in that opening, they had discovered parts of themselves they never knew existed. Their capacity for compassion had expanded. Their understanding of life had deepened. Their appreciation for simple moments had intensified. Some warriors, they prove that might be hard to hear at first. Some wounds stay forever because they're supposed to change us forever. Think about that for a moment. What if the permanent nature of certain wounds isn't a failure of healing, but a success of transformation? Let me share something powerful with you. In my work with thousands of people, I've noticed a fascinating pattern. Those who try desperately to get over their permanent wounds often stay stuck in cycles of frustration and self-judgment. But those who learn to integrate their wounds, to listen to them, to let them inform their way of being in the world, they're the ones who often find the deepest peace. A permanent wound is like a window that's been carved into your soul. Yes, it hurt when it was created. Yes, it changed your structure forever. But now it allows you to see things you couldn't see before, to understand things you couldn't understand before. It gives you access to levels of empathy and insight that wouldn't have been possible without that opening. But here's where many people get stuck. They keep looking at their wounds through the lens of what was lost rather than what was gained. They focus on the scar rather than the strength it represents. They see the break rather than the breakthrough. What if your permanent wounds are actually your greatest teachers? What if they're not just injuries to recover from, but initiations into deeper wisdom? Every time that old pain surfaces, it's not just reopening a wound. It's reopening a doorway to understand. Think about the most compassionate person you know. Chances are they've been through significant pain. Think about the people who seem to have an almost supernatural ability to understand others. More often than not, they're people who have been wounded deeply themselves. Their wounds became their windows into the human experience. Now, I want to address something crucial. The difference between carrying a wound and being carried by it. When you're carried by your wound, it controls your life. It makes your decisions for you. It colors everything you see. But when you learn to carry your wound consciously, it becomes a source of wisdom rather than a source of limitation. Here's a powerful practice I want to share with you. The next time you feel that familiar ache of your permanent wound, instead of trying to push it away or sink into it, try this. One hand over your heart and say, "Thank you for what you've taught me. Thank you for how you've shaped me. Thank you for the wisdom you've given me." This isn't about denying the pain or pretending it doesn't hurt. It's about acknowledging that your wounds have contributed to your wisdom. They've deepened your understanding. They've expanded your capacity for compassion. In many ways, they've made you more fully human. Consider the metaphor of a tree that's been struck by lightning. The scar remains forever, but the tree doesn't stop growing. Instead, it grows around the scar, incorporating it into its structure, becoming more interesting, more unique, more itself, because your permanent wounds can function the same way. Not as limitations, but as unique features of your personal landscape. Let me share something that might surprise you. Sometimes our permanent wounds protect us. They keep us humble. They keep us real. They prevent us from becoming hardened or disconnected from our own humanity. In a world that often pressures us to present perfect, polished versions of ourselves, our wounds keep us authentic. But here's the key. It's not just about accepting your wounds. It's about learning to use them as instruments of understanding. When you encounter someone else in pain, your wound becomes a tuning fork that helps you resonate with their experience. When you need to make important decisions, your wound offers wisdom born from experience rather than. How different would our world be if we stopped trying to hide our wounds and started sharing the wisdom they've given us? What if, instead of seeing our permanent wounds as something to be ashamed of, we recognize them as our unique contribution to the human story? I want you to try something with me. Think about your deepest wound, the one that stayed with you the longest. Now, instead of focusing on the pain it caused, focus on the wisdom it's given you. What do you understand now that you couldn't have understood with? How's it changed the way you relate to others? How has it deepened your capacity for love, for understanding, for compassion? Let's talk about something that might revolutionize how you view your permanent wounds. Their power to create profound connections and catalyze real change in the world. I've discovered that our deepest wounds often become bridges to understanding others in ways that no amount of theoretical knowledge could provide. You see, in our modern world, we're often taught to present ourselves as invulnerable, successful, and perpetually happy. Social media feeds are filled with carefully curated moments of joy and achievement. But real connection, the kind that touches souls and changes lives, happens when we dare to be real about our wounds. Think about the moments when you felt truly understood. Were they moments when someone showed you their perfect life? Or were they moments when someone shared their struggles, their pain, their permanent wounds with raw honesty? It's in these moments of shared vulnerability that real healing begins, not just for ourselves, but for others too. There's a phenomenon I've observed over years of working with people. When one person has the courage to speak honestly about their permanent wounds, it creates a space for others to do the same. It's like watching a room full of people slowly exhale, as if they've been holding their breath, waiting for permission to be real. But here's what's fascinating. When we share our wounds with wisdom rather than bitterness, something magical happens. Our pain becomes a light for others who are still finding their way through the darkness. The very things that once made us feel isolated become the means by which we connect most deeply with others. Every major movement for positive change in our world has been led by people who transform their permanent wounds into catalysts for transformation. They didn't wait until they were completely healed. They began serving others from their wounded places, and in doing so, found deeper healing themselves. I want to share something profound with you, something that might completely shift how you view your permanent wounds. These wounds you carry, they're not just your personal burden. They're part of your unique gift to the world. They've given you a specific type of insight, a particular kind of wisdom that nobody else has in quite the same way. Think about it like if you've experienced profound loss, you understand grief in a way that no amount of training could teach. If you face betrayal, you understand trust and forgiveness at a depth that theory could never reach. If you've known loneliness, you can recognize it in others' eyes and know exactly what they need to hear. But here's where many people get stuck. They think they need to be perfectly healed before they can help others. They wait for all the pain to go away before they step into their power to make a difference. But that's not how it works. Your wound doesn't need to be completely healed for you to help heal others. Sometimes it's your very woundedness that makes you the perfect guide for someone else's healing journey. Your permanent wounds have equipped you with exactly what you need to serve others in a unique way. The sensitivity you develop through your pain, that's a gift. The depth of understanding you gain through your struggles, that's wisdom. The compassion that grew from your hurt, that's healing power. Consider how your permanent wounds have shaped your values, your priorities, your understanding of what really matters in life. Haven't they made you more authentic? Haven't they stripped away the superficial and shown you what's truly important? This is wisdom that can't be learned from books. It can only be earned through lived experience. But here's the key. It's not just about passively accepting that your wounds have changed you. It's about actively choosing to use those changes to create positive impact in the world. Every time you share your story with someone who needs to hear it, every time you extend understanding to someone who's hurting, every time you use your experience to help another person feel less alone, you're transforming your permanent wounds into instruments of healing. What if your permanent wounds aren't just about your personal journey anymore? What if they're actually preparing you for your larger purpose in the world? What if the very experiences that once made you feel broken are actually equipping you to help heal others? Think about the people who've had the biggest impact on your life. Chances are they weren't the ones who had perfect, unscathed lives. They were the ones who had been through their own battles, carried their own wounds, and found a way to transform their pain into purpose. When you learn to carry your permanent wounds with grace and wisdom, you become a living example of possibility for others. You show them that it's possible to be both wounded and powerful, both scarred and beautiful, both hurt and healing. But remember this, sharing your wounds isn't about dumping your pain on others. It's about sharing the wisdom you've gained through your journey. It's about showing others that they're not alone. It's about using your experience to light the way for those who are still finding their path through the darkness. As we come to this final part of our journey together, I want to share something profound with you, something that might forever change how you view the permanent wounds you carry. These wounds that have stayed with you, they're not just scars from your past. They're not just memories that refuse to fade. They're sacred markings of a soul that has lived deeply, loved deeply, and dared greatly. You know, we live in a world that's obsessed with quick fixes and instant solutions. We're told that if something hurts, we should fix it immediately. If something's broken, we should replace it. If something's wounded, we should heal it completely. But what if some things aren't meant to be fixed? What if some breaks are meant to let the light in? What if some wounds are meant to stay forever because they're not injuries, they're initiations? Think about the most significant moments of growth in your life. Weren't many of them born from pain? Didn't many of them come from those wounds that refused to heal completely? That's not coincidence. That's transformation. Every permanent wound you carry is evidence that you've survived something significant. More than that, it's evidence that you've been transformed by something significant. Let me share a profound observation with you. The people who end up making the biggest difference in the world aren't those who've never been wounded. They're the ones who've learned to carry their wounds with grace, who've allowed their pain to deepen their understanding of life, who've used their scars as maps to help others find their way through similar territories. But here's what's crucial to understand. This isn't about glorifying pain. It's not about wearing your wounds as badges of honor or using them as excuses. It's about recognizing that these permanent marks on your soul have shaped you in ways that make you uniquely qualified to understand, to help, to heal others. What if your permanent wounds are actually your greatest gifts to the world? What if the very experiences that once made you feel broken are actually preparing you for your most important work? What if the depth of your pain is directly proportional to the depth of wisdom you have to offer? I want you to try something right now. Close your eyes for a moment and think about your deepest wound. Now, instead of seeing it as a scar, see it as a source of light. Instead of seeing it as a weakness, see it as a wellspring. Instead of seeing it as something that diminishes you, see it as something that has expanded your capacity to understand and love others. You see, the truth about permanent wounds is that they don't just change us, they transform us. They don't just mark us, they make us. They become part of our story, not as chapters of defeat, but as turning points that led to deeper understanding, greater compassion, and more authentic living. But here's the most beautiful part. When we learn to carry our permanent wounds with grace, they become more than just our personal story. They become bridges of understanding to others who are walking similar paths. They become lanterns lighting the way for those still finding their path through the darkness. They become gifts that we can offer to a world that desperately needs more understanding, more compassion, more real human connection. Think about this. Every time you touch your own wound with compassion, you become better equipped to touch others' wounds with healing. Every time you find meaning in your pain, you become better able to help others find meaning in theirs. Every time you transform your suffering into wisdom, you create a map that others can follow. As we close our time together, I want to leave you with this powerful truth. Your permanent wounds are not your weakness. They're your wisdom. They're not your burden. They're your bridge to deeper understanding. They're not your limitation. They're your liberation into a more authentic, more meaningful way of being in the world. Remember, some wounds stay forever, not because we failed to heal, but because they're meant to transform us forever. They're meant to keep us humble, keep us human, keep us connected to the depth and complexity of the human experience. They're meant to remind us that we're all in this together, all carrying our own permanent wounds, all learning to transform our pain into purpose. So I challenge you, stop waiting for all your wounds to heal before you start living fully. Stop waiting for all your pain to disappear before you start helping others. Start right where you are with all your scars and all your wisdom. Let your permanent wounds become your permanent gifts to the world. Because here's the ultimate truth. It's not despite our wounds that we make our greatest contribution to the world. It's because of them. It's not despite our pain that we connect most deeply with others. It's through it. And it's not despite our permanent wounds that we find our greatest purpose. It's because of them, you're not broken. You're not damaged. You're not less because of your permanent wounds. You are more and more wise, more compassionate, more real, more human. And that's exactly what our world needs right now. People who aren't afraid to be real. People who have the courage to carry their wounds with grace. People who understand that their deepest pain can become their greatest gift to others. So carry your permanent wounds with dignity. Share their wisdom with grace. Let them guide you to your purpose. Because in the end, these wounds that stay forever, they're not just about what happened to you. They're about what's happening through you. They're about how you're using your pain to light the way for others. They're about how you're transforming your wounds into wisdom, your scars into stars that help others navigate their own dark nights. Your permanent wounds are not the end of your story. They're the beginning of your most important chapter. The chapter where you discover that your deepest pain can lead to your highest purpose, and that the very things that once made you feel broken can become the means by which you help heal the world. And so as we stand here together at this crossroads of understanding, I want you to make a promise to yourself. Promise that from this moment forward, you'll stop seeing your permanent wounds as your greatest burden and start seeing them as your most profound teachers. Promise that you'll stop waiting for them to disappear and start allowing them to guide you toward your purpose. Because here's what I know with absolute certainty. Somewhere out there, someone needs exactly what your wounds have taught you. Someone needs to hear your story. Someone needs to know they're not alone in their pain. Someone needs the wisdom that only your particular journey could have given you. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up and feel that familiar ache of your permanent wound, remember this moment. Remember that this pain you carry isn't your enemy. It's your ally in understanding the human heart. It's your passport to deeper connections. It's your qualification for making a real difference in someone else's life. You see, we're not meant to go through life unscathed. We're meant to be marked by our experiences, shaped by our struggles, transformed by our trials. And in the end, it's not about how many wounds we carry. It's about what we do with them. It's about how we use them to light the way for others. So stand tall with your permanent wounds. Let them be your teachers. Let them be your guide. Let them be your gift to a world that desperately needs more authentic truth tellers, more wounded healers, more light bearers who aren't afraid to shine from their broken places. Because in the end, these wounds that stay forever, they're not just your story. They're your contribution to the greater human story. They're not just your pain. They're your power. And they're not just your burden to bear. They're your beautiful, sacred opportunity to help heal the world. Remember, you are not your wounds. You are what you choose to do with them. And that choice begins